Hello, I'm John Thomas and welcome to the Mad Hedge Fund Trader channel on YouTube. I'm in London, England this week, where I once lived. They were 10 of the happiest years of my life. I'll be visiting some of my old haunts, remembering the good old days, and take you to a few places in the former capital of the British Empire that you've never heard of. If you learn something about business, the markets, history, or international trade, that won't hurt either. This is not your normal travel show. In fact, some might even call it mad. Let's start by jumping on the London subway, otherwise known as the Underground. The London Underground, otherwise known as the Tube, is the world's oldest subterranean mass transportation system. When I lived here 30 years ago, the escalators were still made out of hardwood imported from colonial India. That was until one caught fire at King's Cross Station and escalated 25 people to their deaths. During a later investigation, it was discovered that the cars involved in an accident were 60 years old, but on further research, it was discovered that even those cars were rebuilt from parts that were 100 years old and dated back to the launch of the system in the late 19th century. It seems that in England, they never throw anything out. During World War II, the deeper stations were used as bomb shelters, where tens of thousands slept safely while London above burned. Today, the Underground is carrying more than 10 times its original design capacity, even though much of it is still made out of wood. Trains run incredibly every 1 to 3 minutes and are always packed. New York, eat your heart out. London Underground also runs the Lost and Found office you see here, displaying items forgotten over the past century. Ever wonder what happened to your old top hat? How about that missing flat iron? With most of London gridlocked in a never-ending traffic jam, the Underground is the only way to get around to an appointment on time and fast. Well, let's go. I thought I needed a new hat the other day, so I came here to Lockin Company on St. James Street in London, the oldest operating hat maker in the world today. They have been making headwear for the kings, queens, generals, admirals, and just plain vanilla celebrities since 1676. I looked at their old order books, and it included the names of Queen Victoria, Winston Churchill, and even Frank Sinatra. One of my distant ancestors, Lord Nelson, placed an order for a new hat just before he left to fight the Battle of Trafalgar against the French in 1803. He was killed in that engagement, shot through the chest by a French sniper, just as the fighting was turning in his favor. The hat is still awaiting pickup 211 years later in a display case for all to see. I really like the look of that Borsalino fedora over there. Even London can get tiring after a few days of hustle and bustle. And with the British pound at $1.80, it helps to have a rich uncle to cover the bills too. Thank goodness I'm a hedge fund trader. So I decided to flee to the bucolic countryside of Cambridge for a day, home of the great 1,000-year-old university. It was with some reverence that I walked the halls of hallowed King's College, where Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA some 59 years ago, earning a Nobel Prize. When Crick later returned to Harvard, he supplied my lab at UCLA with some DNA samples and helped launch me on my career as a scientist. No summer day in Cambridge would be complete without an afternoon of punting a flatboat on the Cambridge River. Of course, the challenge is to remain on the river and not in the river. The problem arises when your pole gets stuck in the mud and you hang on for too long. Traveling downstream, one comes across more than a few students who overrated their abilities at the helm and underrated the river. I almost ended up in the drink myself. Karl Marx, the creator of communism and socialism, had a more profound effect on 20th century history than any other single economist. Born in 1818 and dying in 1883, he was not buried in his native Germany or Mother Russia, but here in Highgate Cemetery in London, where he spent the last third of his life. Marx collaborated with Friedrich Engels to write the Communist Manifesto, and later in 1867, Das Kapital, which created the theoretical foundation for the movements that followed. As a matter of pure prose, it was one of the worst books ever written. I waded through it many years ago and found it turgid, redundant, and exhausting to read. But it was adopted as a new religion by the radical movements, who sought to lift workers up from the abysmal conditions of the day. Perhaps 100 million people died futilely attempting to put Marx's theories into practice, at least 20 million in Russia, and as many as 50 million in China. What Marx got wrong was crucial and offers important insights for many of us today. Marx failed to anticipate how accelerating technology would increase productivity and raise standards of living. That made moot 100 years of working-class revolutions. Today, even though real wages have been falling in the U.S. for 30 years, standards of living are substantially higher than they were in 1984. I see many strategists, portfolio managers, and traders making the same mistakes. However, Marx still has many fans, as the flowers and candles at his grave testify. I happen to enjoy many strange and unusual hobbies, and one of them is searching for vintage clothing. Of course, with my size, I rarely get a chance to buy anything. People were much smaller 50 or 60 years ago, but when I do, it's a real treat. Suffice it to say, I end up with some really interesting things to wear. From that well-worn pair of saddle shoes to my great Tyrolean suede jacket. I'm not just looking for fashionable threads at these events. For me, each garment is veritably dripping with history. It tells the history of manufacturing, how clothes evolved, and the advancement of technology. The experts can tell you the precise year when a Pendleton shirt introduced buttons on their pockets and when they jumped from brass to plastic ones. It also tells you of the history of international trade. In my lifetime, my wardrobe has evolved from American-made, then made in Japan, migrated to China, and now comes from Bangladesh. If any of you boomers out there still have your US-made suits from the 70s, don't donate them to the Salvation Army. They may be worth a fortune, and double so for your old button-fly Levi Strauss blue jeans. Made in America is in right now, and collectors will pay a king's ransom for the real deal. Hey, excuse me for a moment, but I think that black bowler hat over there looks kind of cool. One can't visit London without stopping by the home of the greatest investigative detective of all times, Sherlock Holmes. So after a quick trip on the Underground, I was standing on the doorstep of the inveterate sleuth's residence at 221B Baker Street, guarded by an English bobby, or at least an actor portraying to be an English policeman. You see, Sherlock Holmes is a fictional character created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in the 19th century, and therefore cannot have a real home. The structure you see before you was created during the 1970s, when the English tourist trade really took off like a rocket. It is further proof that every surge in demand will inevitably meet a supply, whether it is real or not. I have always been a huge fan of Sherlock Holmes, and have read the entire 4,000-page output of his author. Looking for great trade sometimes requires the skills of a master detective. Holmes believed that if you eliminate the obvious, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the answer. I can't tell you how often that is true in trading. Doyle was originally trained as a physician and started writing in 1882 while waiting for tardy patients to make their appointments. That was the source of Holmes' loyal companion, the bumbling Dr. Watson. When Doyle's stories were finally published in 1888, they were a sensation, serialized in daily newspapers across the country. Doyle finally killed off Sherlock Holmes in 1891, pushing him over Switzerland's Reichenbach Falls in a death grip with the evil Dr. Moriarty. The next day, much of the reading public of England wore armbands in black. Some 12 years later, after much public pressure, Doyle brought his favorite character back to life in 1903 with a new book, The Return of Sherlock Holmes. He continued to spin tales of mystery and deceit until 1927 and passed away in 1930. In his later years, Arthur Conan Doyle became a bit of a nutcase. After losing several close family members, he began a long search for a way to contact the dead, attending seances and becoming an ardent spiritualist. He even became close friends with the great American magician Harry Houdini, hoping to reach the dead. What's that? The game's afoot. Time to head off for my next destination. The highlight of my career as a journalist was my decade working for the Economist magazine, the greatest newspaper in the world. If you only had time to read one magazine a week and get up-to-date news about international business, politics, and technology, this is it. 40 years ago, while working as the magazine's Tokyo correspondent, I used to type out a paper tape on a teletype machine in order to transmit my stories back to this office in London. That was way back when the London press was ruled by fractious unions and printed papers with cold-rolled type in huge, noisy, and costly industrial facilities. Once, the Economist invented an entire country off the west coast of India called Sans Serif, which appeared on the map in the shape of a giant comma. Only the sub-editors figured out that every town, business, and politician in the country was named after a typeface. This was before computers made us all experts on the many types of script in use today. In the end, the April 1st publication date gave it all away, April Fool's Day. The management once complained that the journalists were spending too much time in the pub next door, which happened to be the former London embassy of the old Republic of Texas. So they arranged to have each writer receive a bottle of white wine, red wine, and gin every week just to keep us at our desks. It worked. I can't imagine that custom survives today. As a wet behind the ears foreign correspondent, I really learned to write here. Every week, I sent in 1,500 words to my editor, the dear but late Peter Martin, who sent back 400 words saying 3 times as much as I did. Go through that every week for 10 years, and you learn to publish or die. Well, that's enough time spent strolling down memory lane. I think I'll head up to St. James Park and grab the Underground to my next destination. One amazing thing about the global economy is that when a good idea succeeds in one city, it catches fire and spreads around the world. So when my hometown of San Francisco started closing down major streets on weekends and turning them into pedestrian zones, it was just a matter of time before it caught on in Chicago, New York, and here in London. Today, the busiest street in the city, Regent Street, has been turned into a park for the day. Traffic be damned. The town fathers also invited London Transport to display its entire collection of antique buses, which you see here. Some of these vintage vehicles are horse-drawn from the 19th century. Others figure prominently in movies set in World Wars I and II, or even the Sherlock Holmes era. My grandfather drove a truck with hard rubber tire like these during the First World War. He once told me they had to jack up the vehicle at night because the tires, made out of natural rubber, would freeze. If you didn't warm them up the next morning with a fire, they would shatter as soon as you started driving. Ah, the wonder of new technology that brought us pneumatic tires and synthetic rubber. I think I'll walk up Oxford Street near Selfridge's department store and catch the tube. Hoping that you have enjoyed my unorthodox, if not unconventional, tour of London. I will be visiting other cities around the world in the near future, and I'm happy to share my experiences with you. As for me, I'm off to the nearest pub for a pint of fine British lager. That's if I can scrounge up a couple of quid first. This is John Thomas, the Mad Hedge Fund Trader, signing off. Good luck and good trading.